somehow I'm going to cover 3 centuries of history in 15 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. As Ken said, thank you, Ken, for that introduction. My name is Jon-Paul Dyson. I am Vice President for Exhibit Research and Development at The Strong, and also Director of the International Center for the History of Electronic Games at The Strong in Rochester, New York. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But what I'd like to talk about today is history. And do that with a certain amount of trepidation. This is probably a favorable crowd, but an experience a few days ago at one of my son's Little League games where the moms, and I was the only guy there, were talking about school subjects. Somehow it turned to history and social studies. And there was this resounding sort of agreement that history and social studies were the most boring subjects in school ever. And it went on for about 10 minutes before it came about that I was actually a historian. At which point people sort of dragged from the recess of their memory the one positive experience they had of history in school. But I'd like to use history because I think it really informs a lot of our thinking about games for change, games for learning, what their potentials are. So today I'd like to explore the origins of games for change and games for learning, how they've changed over time, maybe where they stand today, and what lessons we can learn from the past for games today, and maybe some hints at where they're going in the future. I said I'll try to do that all in 15 minutes. I'm from The Strong, which is in Rochester, New York, and we are a museum that has 5 we call play partners. We have the American Journal of Play, which is a peer-reviewed academic journal, comes out quarterly. It's available online for free, as well as in bound copies, which are not for free, but the online version is free at journalofplay.org. And it's really a wonderful resource on play, studies in play, and I recommend you check it out. We also are home in the Brian Sutton Smith Library Archives of Play. I don't know if anyone knows who Brian Sutton Smith is, but he's one of the three foremost play scholars of the 20th century, along with Johann Huizinga, Roger Caillois, and Brian Sutton Smith, and we have his papers there and a collection of more than 140,000 primary and secondary works on play. It's a wonderful resource, and a little pitch here for anyone doing research on play. We just announced a series of fellowship programs to come and do research at the museum. So you can go to our website at thestrong.org if you're interested, if you're doing research on the history of play and want to study that. We're also home in the National Toy Hall of Fame. Every year we induct 2 to 3 toys. Most are common, like Hot Wheels or checkers. Occasionally we go out of the box, so to speak, and induct things like the stick or the cardboard box. Anyone who's had a child or seen a child, ignore the present on Christmas or Hanukkah morning and go for the box instead, can appreciate that. But they're toys that are iconic, they last, and they promote creativity, learning, and discovery, all of which the box do. We're also the home of the International Center for the History of Electronic Games, which has the world's largest public collection of video games and related artifacts, nearly 40,000, ranging from about 150 arcade games, including Computer Space and Pong, which if you saw Nolan Bushnell's talk last night, all the way up to the most recent games, as well as things like game developers' papers from people like Ken and Roberta Williams, Will Wright, Ralph Baer, that show how the games were created and not only how they've changed over time, but what their impact on society has been. Another little pitch, if you're working on something, you want to share stuff with us to archive, love to talk with you. And finally, we have the National Museum of Play at The Strong. As I said, we're in Rochester. It's a large museum. It's about 260,000 square feet. We're really a history-based museum. Some people think of us as a children's museum. If so, we're the 3rd largest in the world. We get about 600,000 guests a year coming from all over the country, largely Southern Ontario, upstate New York especially, but throughout the country. Has anyone ever been to The Strong here? Okay, so we have a couple people who've been here. Our flight from JetBlue, from New York City on JetBlue if you want to come. And really the basis of what we have there are our collections. And those are, so we have the world's largest play collection, more than 400,000 toys, dolls, games, and video games. And they range here, you can see everything from the arcade games I mentioned earlier to games like Mystery Date. Anyone ever play Mystery Date? Any Mystery Date? Okay, one back here. Mystery Date, in case, I can start riffing on toys here if you want to get. Mystery Date is one where you open the door and you reveal whether your date is a dream or a dud. It's a great window into 1960s aesthetic standards because if you open it now, the dream is like this geeky guy with a bowling bag. And the dud looks like something he just walked out of the pages of a fashion magazine, sort of scruffy, sort of X-Gamer looking or something like that. So it's a complete reversal. We have things like the first prototype Ken doll, Barbie #1, and Build Lily, which was the inspiration of Barbie, and little known fact, some of you may know, was in fact actually a streetwalker. She was a German doll. We also have, if anyone's ever heard of the Barbie Liberation Organization, which is a group that the BLO found Teen Talk Barbies and Fighting Duke G.I. Joes, and switched to voice boxes in them. And then the really diabolical thing was they actually put them back into the stores for people to bring home and give to their children on Christmas morning. And so when little Johnny opened up his Fighting Duke doll, action figure, Fighting Duke action figure, he got, let's go shopping, and math class is hard. Whereas the Teen Talk Barbie cried, fight, shout. And so quite a few good surprises. So we really want to represent the history of play, and both in physical form, but also in documentary form. And I bring that background, I offer that background to give you some perspective on why I'm looking at history of play and why I want to talk about it, because I think it informs how we think about games today. And let me just say, I'll just say we have interactive exhibits, very hands-on. We combine interactivity with artifacts, with interpretation. Sort of a unique model, or at least a rare model in there. We have partnerships with Sesame Workshop, with Berenstein Bears, with Wegmans Supermarket Chain, a 12,000 square foot exhibit on history of children's books called Reading Adventureland, one history of superheroes, and a video game exhibit called E-Game Revolution, which is 5,000 square feet of video games, including many you probably haven't played since you were 10. So I want to begin by talking about what is play, and I think that's really key for understanding what the potential is here. And I was editor of our American Journal of Play for a while, and I'd say about a third of the papers we had submitted began with some variation of this statement. No one can quite agree on what play is, or in a definition of play. And this is something that scholars have gone back and forth. But there are a few common characteristics that, if you look at play, I think you see. And I had them here. 1, play is fun. 2, play is voluntary. And 3, play is its own end. And I just want to unpack these for a minute because I think they have a lot of impact as we think for Games for Change, what the possibilities are for Games for Change and Games for Learning, and also maybe what some of the potential problems are in this space. First of all, they're fun. This has been a recurring theme throughout the talks I've heard. The games need to be fun. They need to be good games. And this is true of play in general. If it's not fun, maybe it's not play. Doesn't mean you're always smiling, but it's still probably fun. Second, and I think this is really crucial, play is voluntary. You can't be forced to play. If you're forced to play, you're probably not playing. Now, this potentially presents a problem. In certain settings, we may want to use play to make kids learn or help kids learn. How do we do it in a way that they don't feel forced, that they feel like in some way voluntary? So play. And finally, perhaps trickiest, is play is its own end. When kids are roughhousing, they are getting a lot of benefits from that. They're improving strength, they're improving physical coordination, they're building social bonds, but that's not why they're roughhousing. When kids are playing Monopoly, they are gaining skills in terms of adding, using money, conniving with their siblings to defeat their other sibling, whatever it is. But that's not the reason they're playing Monopoly. They're playing Monopoly to have fun and to play. Play is its own end. Now, play yields tremendous benefits, but again, it's not the reason they do that. So what does this then tell us about what we can do in terms of games for learning? So I'm going to take us on a little historical tour now and think about that, and I start with John Locke. And I guess I could read this all, but pay attention to this as you look at this. Is from John Locke, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which comes out in 1693. John Locke, as you probably know, is an Enlightenment philosopher, most noted for his political philosophy, which is really the basis of a lot of the American American Revolution, Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. So, but John Locke also wrote about education. And in this book, which he wrote for a friend, which was advice to his friend for raising his child. Now, John Locke didn't have any children, didn't know what he was talking about in some ways, but he actually gave some good advice. So the idea was to give his friend advice for a tutor who would be spending one-on-one time with a child. And if you think about education in the 17th century, it wasn't fun. There's a lot, the whip was probably more used than laughter. And so what John Locke revolutionizes the thinking about this, he points to a few things. He says, none of the things they are to learn, talking about children, should ever be made a burden to them or imposed on them as a task. Think about the two aspects. Fun. If play is fun, it's not a burden. It's not a task. It's voluntary. Whatever is so proposed presently becomes irksome. The mind takes an aversion to it, though before it were a thing of delight or indifferency. Let a child but be ordered to whip his top at a certain time every day, whether or not he has a mind to it. Let this be but required of him as a duty, wherein he must spend so many hours morning and afternoon, and see whether or not he will soon be weary of any play at this rate. We could probably modernize this. Make a kid play Team Fortress 2 every day at a certain time. He'll get tired of it. This is still true. There's that voluntary aspect of play, and again, this gets tricky for us. And so what Locke does says, okay, how do you work with this? Knowing that the play needs to be voluntary, knowing that the play needs to be fun, knowing that the play needs to be perceived by the child as its own end, how do you do this? And so one of the suggestions he says is take dice and on the side, paste letters. One die, put out the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and Y, he says, counts as a vowel. And then on the other dice, put consonants and then throw them. So John Locke invented boggle early on, about 400 years ago. And he says, do this. Well, people look at this idea and say, hey, that's a good idea. And out of this comes the alphabet block. So the alphabet block is a direct ancestor of Locke's idea, the idea that you can take a child's toy and make it into a learning tool that allows them to learn all sorts of things about literacy. This is not the only 18th century innovation that's coming in. There's also, at this point, something called a dissected map or dissected puzzle. And this is, again, the same idea that you can take a plaything and learn something from it. This one up here is actually one that was created for the children of George III, and the one on the right is one from our collection at the Strong. It's a 19th century dissected map of the United States. The geography is not quite the same as it is today. But so the point here is that you can take something and make it into a plaything, and this appealed to parents who were imbibing Locke's advice and who had a new attitude towards child rearing, who says, we want to raise our children in a way that is rational but amusing. Use methods that are rational but amusing. You see these words used a lot in the 18th century and early 19th century. Rational is one, then amusing is another, or they might say instructing but enjoyable. And so in this, you find these methods. And this brings us the example of the alphabet blocks and the dissected puzzle, the dissected map, which becomes the jigsaw puzzle later on, leads me to the first point I want to make, a lesson we can learn, is let's think play and not just games. I think games are a subset of play, but there are a lot of possibilities for using play as opposed to games. Does anyone know what the best-selling computer game of all time is? Sims. It's based, Will Wright has talked about it being based on a dollhouse. It is essentially, and some people dismissed it initially as a toy, and actually Will Wright himself has talked about it, is it more like a toy? Saying actually very similar to SimCity. Let's look at play. I think when you look online, what's going on, there's a lot of discussion about boys and girls, how much time they spend playing games. And there's, even as the rate of girls doing online games has gone up, it still doesn't match boys, both in terms of quite numbers and also certainly in terms of frequency. But I bet if you widen the category and said, let's look at online play, look how girls use social media sites, for instance, then I think you'll find that the percentages are much closer to each other, in fact, may skew the other way. So let's look at play versus games. And I don't know if any of you saw the presentation yesterday on the Your Turn, where the guys from Vienna talked about using the mashups for YouTube. That to me is a great example of using play as opposed to games for doing things. So that's the first lesson. I'd next like to go quickly through the revolution in children's books that happens. And again, thinking about things that are not necessarily games, what you have are people pointing to these, and this is Anna Letitia Barbold, who was one of a series of mostly female authors who found ways to use books for educational purposes. So really, we're interested in teaching, especially moral lessons. This one you see here, or character lessons. At the bottom right, you may not be able to read it. It says, what is a nose for? To smell with. What are legs for? To walk with. They do not, then do not make mama carry you. Walk yourself. Here are 2 good legs. If any of you have children, that's still sound advice that you sometimes want to reach for, I know. So you have books happening, but what happens is books are sold to parents, and they're sold in very small quantities. We have a letter from a girl growing up in Albany in 1804 who talks about how her dad brought home 3 or 4 books, and she says, it was accounted to us that we had a library. Books are only available to very few, and it's not until you have largely religious organizations, especially the Sunday school unions, creating books in mass volume that are produced cheaply, that you really have a revolution in children's literature and a whole bunch of series of books that are really books for change, books for learning. In this case, you're trying to put forth religious values, but they're the ones that really bring mass consumption of children's books to the general public. Things that often were lavishly illustrated compared to other copies. And this gets us to, one more example, is Friedrich Froebel, the founder of kindergarten, who, if anyone knows, these are his gifts, which are the series of gifts that he would give to children, who would then use those to play with, and they go in a series of escalating gifts. And the idea was that you would use playthings to teach. And this brings us to the second point I want to stress, both with the Sunday school unions and with Froebel. Both are successful at getting games for change, games for learning out in the public, and they give us a fundamental that institutional ecosystems sustain serious play. I think this is a really important thing. In our museum, we have at least, I'd say, 5,000 or 6,000 educational computer games. The problem is not so much that we need more games, so we always need more games. I guess it'd be like saying we need more books, but we don't. But it's key that we develop institutions that can disseminate these games, get them into the hands of people who need them. Otherwise, games will be produced and they'll die in a vacuum. And so until you have institutional ecosystems that can sustain games for learning, games for change, it's not going to be very successful. Want to go through quickly just a couple points. These are a lot of games. There's a revolution in board game design, and board games don't really start till the 19th century. In the 19th century, and you can't read it, it's too small, but these are all about this game on the left is the game Checkered Game of Life, which comes out in 1860, and is a forerunner to the Game of Life, which comes out 100 years later, and it's probably the most banal game ever created. Maybe next to Candyland. So the Checkered Game of Life, these are all about teaching values. So if you look, you can't read this, but some of the things in here, and you may be able to see, if you land on the right squares, honesty, industry, move you forward. Here on the left, if you go to on the wrong squares, it could lead to ruin, poverty, or suicide, which is not something I hope any of you are putting in your games. And the district messenger boy similarly has values to avoid, like inattention, loitering, and pertinence. We don't have time for question and answers, I don't think, so we won't get to that one today. Or drowsiness, which you may be feeling after lunch. These are 2 examples. This is Thomas Edison's talking doll. It could speak, it could sing. It was a total commercial flop. It used a wax cylinder that broke, it had a screechy voice, and it had a hard metal body that no children loved. The same year that comes out, 1890, Martha Chase, a woman from Rhode Island who develops dolls, who she wants to encourage nurturing, as well as later they used to teach habits of cleanliness, and especially in hospitals, she creates a soft doll, which is very different from the other dolls that come at the time. And so Thomas Edison's doll, Martha Chase's doll, both share a common lesson, which is that technology should serve play, not play serve technology. Don't embrace the latest technology just because this is new. What made those board games successful was mass manufacturing, a new technology. But the play itself was very basic and very old. Martha Chase used very old materials. Thomas Edison used the latest thing. So as you develop things, especially in the digital space, think about what's persistent and what is going to be fleeting and what is going to be widely adapted. I'm going to, I think, skip over a couple. These are just to give an example of friendship dolls, which come out actually in 1927, not 1923, developed by Sidney Gulick, whose brother, Luther Gulick, invented maybe the most famous game for learning of all time, which is basketball. But these were designed to create friendship between Japan and the US at a time when there was a lot of tension, there were immigration restriction policies. Again, and think play, not necessarily just games. Evolution Monopoly, I don't have time to get into this, but it starts actually as an educational game called the Landlord's Game in 1904, and created by a woman, Lizzie McGee, who was designed to promote Henry George's idea of the single tax, which was designed to reduce inequity in society. And the idea is that you would play 5 rounds and learn the evils of Monopoly. Over time, it morphed through some folk versions, and in the 1930s, an unemployed plumber named Charles Darrow took a version that had changed. The rules had changed so that the point was then to destroy your enemies and bankrupt them, and to play until the game ended, which was usually about 5 hours. But anyway, so it comes out there in the Great Depression, and it is a good example, and it has continued, one of those few games, along with maybe Pit, that really has sustained, that's a creative game that's sustained over time, and that leads to the next thing, that good play lasts. And again, this has been a theme throughout a lot of things. Good game value always makes a difference. And so I'd like to end with this one, with Oregon Trail, because I think it sums up a lot of the points here and things to remember, in part because I'm also running out of time. But Oregon Trail comes out in 1973. A guy, Don Rawich, creates Oregon Trail. And Oregon Trail is still being played. And I think what's interesting about it is a couple things that really illustrate these points. First of all, it has good play value. It's a very understandable story. People get it. Secondly, it's not based on one technology. It started on a teletype printer hooked to a mainframe computer in which players played, and one of the things they did, for instance, anyone played Oregon Trail okay, yeah, so a lot of things, yeah. You remember the hunting thing, where you hunted animals? Well, that was originally in a teletype printer. You hunted by successfully typing the word bang, B-A-N-G. If you made no typos, you killed the animal. Well, it's not a great game mechanic, but it's one that they could then port, and actually when you have the computers in, say, the Apple IIe, are able to make into a successful hunting game. And so what you find with Oregon Trail is that it's able to persist, and now is on the iPhone. I believe there's an iPad version, but it's really been able to last. Went through CD-ROM, and so you have this this common feature of both good gameplay, not dependent on technology, and finally, I think the most important thing, as I talked earlier, is institutional support. It was distributed by the Minnesota Educational Computer Consortium, and they not only made the game available, but gave teachers useful context for using it in their classroom. And so I think as we think about games for learning and games for change, we need to think not only about the good play value, and not only think about the technology that's being used, but also think, do we have the institutions and the infrastructures to support it and to make them really usable at a time when teachers have little time, are dealing with standards, and often are confronted by a wealth of information and no real option for telling what's good and what's not. Thanks.